we're going to be talking about Iran. The ceasefire seems to be dead. The June MOU that was supposed to pull the U.S. and Iran back from the brink is now, as they say, in the dustbin of history. And what's replaced it is a grinding, deadly stalemate with no clear exit. The U.S. has carried out at least 10 straight nights of airstrikes on Iran, hitting critical infrastructure and, by Iran's health ministry count, killing at least 50 people and wounding more than 500 since the bombing resumed. And Iran has hit back. 2 U.S. soldiers were killed in Jordan, a third killed in Iraq, bringing the total U.S. fatalities that we know of in this conflict to around 17. And the Iranians are vowing that not a single drop of fuel passes through the Strait of Hormuz while the attacks continue. And if the map is also widening, Yemen's Ansar Allah just declared a maritime embargo on Saudi shipping through Bab el-Mandeb, meaning both ends of the Arabian Peninsula are now contested waterways. Oil stockpiles are running low, gas prices are spiking again, and inside Iran, the U.S. has battered the power grid, which is buckling under a heat wave, leaving big swaths of the country sweltering in the dark, and some even without water, after the U.S. hit water desalination pumps over the weekend. And yesterday, U.S. intelligence agencies quietly admitted what should have been obvious from the start, that this bombing campaign is unlikely to move Iran at all. So where does that leave this war? To make sense of it from inside the country, we're joined by Tehran-based journalist Navid Zarrinnal. Navid, it's a pleasure to have you on Breakthrough Live.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, like I mentioned in the intro, Navid, U.S. intel agencies just concluded that Iran, which withstood a far heavier month-long assault earlier in the year without conceding anything, is likely to endure this lighter and probably shorter campaign too. From where you sit in Tehran, what's your read on Iran's position right now relative to the U.S.?
So I would say they have a better position. So even though they are weaker technologically and militarily, they still have the leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. And that is a huge leverage because Donald Trump and the US have to worry about global markets and the global economy in a very different way that Iran has to worry about its economy, because Iran has built a resistance economy for the past 47 years. So it can absorb this kind of pressure on its economy much better than the US, that has to keep its own population content, but also the broader population, because US does have power over the integrated global economy in a very different way than Iran. Iran is a sanctioned country, so it doesn't have to worry about the global economy in the same way. So that in itself will give Iran leverage through the Strait of Hormuz, because by effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz, that will jeopardize the global economy, as you mentioned, Rania, the flow of oil, the production of fertilizers, and everything else that is dependent on oil production. And also when it comes to the people's resolve and the people's resilience, that's still happening here. So people are on the streets every night, and they are protesting the unprovoked U.S.-Israeli aggression on the country. So the people are also prepared to keep fighting. And the state, too, despite Donald Trump claiming that the U.S. has destroyed Iran's military capabilities, that is not true by the assessment of the Iranians and also even by the assessment of American intelligence. So Iran, I would say, is ready to fight. We have to see what happens in the coming weeks. But for now, I would say that primarily because of the Strait of Hormuz, Iran has the upper hand in this conflict.
You know, and interesting you say that, Navid, because Iran has answered the U.S. escalation with escalation, and the strikes on Jordan are perhaps the sharpest example of this. And there's speculation that the Jordan-based interceptors are Israel's last line of defense. And so this means that hitting them means that Israel becomes more and more exposed the longer this goes on. Do you buy this read? And more broadly, many across the region are casting Iran's fight not just as a battle for its own survival, but for the sovereignty of West Asia against Western domination. So living in Iran, does that framing match how people there understand what they're dealing with right now?
No, definitely. So, to the second part of your question, this is fundamentally about sovereignty because for years, people in the West were propagandized by the nuclear issue. And since 2003, when Iran's nuclear program was first discovered by foreign intelligence, everything has been made about the nuclear program. I mean, the nuclear program has some importance because world powers, especially Western countries, do not want Iran to have nuclear weapons, even though so far it is only a nuclear energy program. So the nuclear issue is somewhat important, but it's secondary to the sovereignty issue. And the reason that the nuclear issue becomes important is precisely because of sovereignty. Because if Iran is sovereign and has nuclear programs, the nuclear weapons, that becomes a major issue for the US and the West. So this is fundamentally about sovereignty, and it goes back to the 1979 revolution when Iranians had an anti-imperialist revolution that it was demanding anti-imperialism, anti-Zionism, and also economic equality. I would say the third principle of economic equality wasn't achieved as successfully as the first two principles, which was anti-Zionism and anti-imperialism. And because of those two principles of the revolution that Iran has actually pursued beyond ideals and the slogans, the US and Israel attacked Iran. And so in the US, I mean, you see this narrative both on the left and the right, including the America First people, that this is Israel's war and we should not be fighting it. And that's true to an extent. I mean, Israel and the Israel lobby was a necessary condition for the attacks on Iran. But at the same time, it's also an American war. And the US is at war with Iran's sovereignty. And the reasons that the negotiations also fall apart is because the US refuses to accept the principle that Iran is a sovereign country.
And to the issue of Jordan, I was just curious if you could, just to follow up on the Jordan aspect of this, why such an emphasis on Jordan right now?
Yeah, so I mean, I think partly the emphasis is because it is easier and more effective for Iran to target neighboring countries like Bahrain, like Kuwait, like Qatar, like the UAE, and even Saudi Arabia. But Jordan and Israel are further away. And I think Iran has had some successes in targeting the US radars and defensive system in the Persian Gulf region. But if they're able to successfully dismantle some of the defensive infrastructure in Jordan, Israel, as Zoe was mentioning, would become much more vulnerable. And I don't have clear assessment yet of the successes of Iran in targeting the U.S.-Israeli so-called defensive infrastructure in Jordan. But what the Iranians and also the Americans confirm is that there were Iranian missiles that struck the U.S. base. So U.S. is using an air base in Jordan in order to conduct some of its attacks on Iran. And they were, I think, using it even before the Iran war to attack some of the ISIS elements in Iraq and Syria. But that base, so despite the denials of the Jordanian officials that they are not hosting or enabling the U.S. attacks on Iran, that is false. That is plainly false. And they are doing that. So Iran was able to successfully strike. So not only just launch the missiles, but actually strike their targets in the U.S. airbase in Jordan. And as I think you mentioned, 2 to 3 American soldiers were also killed in those attacks. But the Iranians are claiming that the number of casualties are probably higher. But the American officials are thus far concealing the higher numbers of deaths and injuries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, Navid, I wanted to ask you, this is something that Marco Rubio said over the weekend. And this is something that the Americans often say, but it was just recently said by Marco Rubio. So I'm going to focus on him. He argued that Iran is this rich country that's been brought to ruin by its own spending on Hezbollah and Hamas and quote unquote sponsoring terrorism. I'm actually going to quote what he said. He said, Iran is a rich country. One of the reasons why Iran is in shambles is because every penny that this regime ever gets, be it through sanctions relief or through the oil they're able to to get out. They invest in Hezbollah, they invest in Hamas. They should be spending billions of dollars building their country, but instead they use it to sponsor terrorism. Now, people reacted to this statement by highlighting the irony that the U.S. spends nearly $3,000 per capita on defense, while Iran actually spends something like $80 per capita. That's a 30 to 40 times more per person that the U.S. is spending than Iran on a military budget, right? But I just wanted to raise that because I know this is a grievance about money going to regional partners while ordinary Iranians struggle. It does resonate with some people inside Iran, and I know that a lot of outside media promotes that inside Iran. So I'm curious how that debate actually sounds in Iran and what your thoughts are on this argument.
Yeah, so it's actually really funny because there is this weird ideological agreements between Marco Rubio and the talking points of the Iranian diaspora opposition in the US. So as you're familiar, I think your audience is also familiar with the Iranian opposition in the US. So if they go to rallies in which they participate, basically they're pro-war rallies at this point because the opposition diaspora wants the US to attack Iran. And at those rallies in places like DMV and in places like LA and California, they're waving the Israeli and the Pahlavi flag together. And the Pahlavi was the dynasty that preceded the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And the opposition wants the son of the Shah to return to Iran via US and Israeli help. And they say the exact same thing, that Iran has all these resources and they're wasting it by investing it in Hezbollah and Hamas and the regional resistance. But what they don't understand is that imperialism is a common problem. So I think the Iranian foreign policy decision makers have understood this, that once you claim your sovereignty, then you will be attacked. And in order to protect yourself, you have to have a strategy. You have to have regional allies, and you have to invest in your defense. Because if Iran did not invest in its defense, it would not have the missiles right now to defend itself against US and Israel. And also, it would not have the regional allies like the Houthis or Hezbollah to come to its assistance. And also, I think what's really important to emphasize here, and Marco Rubio and the Iranian opposition will not tell you this, but the fate of the region is interconnected at this point, because as you see, this is a broader war. Israel, before attacking Iran, Israel attacked 7 countries in the region, and everyone is in a way vulnerable. Where you are, Rania, in Lebanon, people are vulnerable. In Palestine, in Gaza, and the West Bank, they have been the most vulnerable. And the region more broadly, I mean, there are even theories that Israel might eventually want to attack Turkey because it cannot tolerate regional competition. So I don't know how true that theory is, but it is something to think about given Israel's previous and recent behavior. So everyone's fate is interconnected. And so the thing is that Iran would either surrender, like a country like Jordan that receives a lot of US aid, and basically the country's operated through US financial assistance. So Iran would either surrender and everybody else would surrender and would just give up sovereignty, and then the whole place would basically become a real estate venture for the likes of Jared Kushner and the Trump family, or they would fight for sovereignty in conjunction with regional allies. And that is what Iran is doing.
Well, it's interesting, Navid, that you bring up the interconnectedness of all of these fronts and kind of this ongoing escalation for the past 3 years, because in tandem, as Rania mentioned in the intro, Ansar Allah has also just declared a maritime escalation embargo on Saudi shipping through Bab al-Mandab in retaliation for this, the Saudi-backed Yemeni government's attack on the Sana'a airport. So now you have Iran contesting the Strait of Hormuz in the east, and Ansar Allah contesting Bab al-Mandab in the west, both ends of the peninsula. So how significant is this Yemeni escalation from Tehran's vantage point? And is this being understood in Iran as a coordinated axis tightening of the screws? Or is that a Western overread of what are really kind of 2 separate escalations?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think that the proxy theory is not true. There's a double standard too, because if you're going to call Iran a proxy, then you should say call Jordan a proxy too, or even Israel a proxy of the US, or Ukraine, say, a proxy of Europe. So you have to be consistent at least. But even so, say we put the consistency issue aside, I would say that they're not proxies because they do have independent action and independent foreign policy, but Iran is their ally. So they try to talk to each other and see what the mutual interests are and act based on that. And in this case, I would say this is what happened because the Ansarullah or the Houthis realized that Saudi has waged a long war on them, and right now they are the Saudi have blockaded the Yemeni airport in Sana'a. And so all that pressure that Saudi is putting on them and also allying with the US in a sense, and all that stuff. So the Yemenis have realized that, for their own sake, such as the Saudi war on them and also the Saudi blockade of their airports, and also because of helping Iran to fight Israel, because Israel is their common enemy, they have acted. So I would say it's a combination of both. So it's both their own interests and also the broader Iranian and regional interests against Israel and against defending the region against Israel. And so for my understanding is that thus far they have only closed Bab al-Mandab to the Saudis, but eventually if they extend it and make it a more comprehensive blockade, I think that would really assist Iran in fighting off the US-Israeli aggression.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see how that plays out. Then I wanted to ask you, first of all, I just wanted to say Trump has, I know Trump says things all the time, but Trump has recently announced that the U.S. will be hitting the area where Iran's nuclear centrifuges are rumored to be soon, probably pretty soon, and there's not a thing they can do about it. That's what he just told reporters. So, the rhetoric is certainly escalating. And I want to remind people that the U.S. has now bombed Iran repeatedly during what were supposed to be negotiations, which is, breaking the agreement each time. A senior Iranian official has already told MS Now that the MOU is no longer valid. So what is the actual view inside Iran about ever sitting back down with an adversary that shreds every deal it signs? Is there any diplomatic off-ramp left that Iran would even find credible at this point? Or has Washington convinced Iran that there's no point in talking anymore?
That's right. So I think how we have to understand the negotiations is that if we understand colonial history, we understand that the U.S. is not terribly serious about negotiations. I think part of the problem with a lot of the Iran experts in the West, people like Vali Nasr and Trita Parsi, is that they kind of have this naive faith in the negotiations, or they take it too seriously. I don't know, maybe in the heart of hearts, they kind of know that the negotiations are bogus, but at least the way they're presented to the public, they take it as these kind of serious diplomatic solutions that could go somewhere. But I think the reason we have the same kind of a demographic here. So the so-called the reformists or the moderates, they're also very naive about negotiations, and even some of the elements within the IRGC or the Revolutionary Guard, because they probably think that if there is a peace, permanent peace with the US, they would be able to get nice contracts from big companies like Google and Apple and become wealthy, because the IRGC, in addition to military power, they also have economic power. So I think they think that they could, in a way, enter. I'm not talking. There are very revolutionary elements within the IRGC, and that's what Iran is fighting. But there are also these elements that are a little bit more liberal in their approach, and they think that there could be, economic normalization and the lifting of sanctions, and Iran could enter the global economy and they would become rich because of it. So I think there is that naivety on both sides. But if you're familiar with colonial history, and I think the problem with a lot of these analysts is that they don't know much about history beyond, say, the past 100 years. And for many of them, even it stops at the Second World War. So they start with the Second World War and they come to 2026, a very presentist approach to the world. But if you have a historical approach to it, you understand that the way imperialism operates is that it does not negotiate for peace. It will only negotiate for surrender, especially in the Iranian-US context, given everything we know about the past 10 years and how things have panned out with the Obama administration not respecting the JCPOA and also the Trump administration withdrawing from it and bombing Iran twice during negotiations, And again, with the memorandum of understanding violating that, even though they claim that Iran violated it, but point 5 of the memorandum is very clear that Iran will make arrangements for the safe passage of commercial vessels through the strait. I think there's no ambiguity there, but US refused to respect that. And once Iran responded, then they started attacking Iran again. So I would say negotiations at this point are pretty, they're very ineffective, but they can be used as a weapon of war. So the US has used negotiations as the weapon of war for the past 20-something years. And I think Iran has realized this too now. Before, I think they were kind of naive about it. But now I think what they're doing is that they will use negotiation as an opportunity in order to get the upper hand on the battlefield and in the conflict. And there are, as I mentioned, within the country, there are those two kind of camps, the people who are more optimistic about negotiations, but the ones that say we can't do it at all. But I think there's kind of a middle ground too. So the people that realize that negotiations can be used as a weapon of war, and they will use it strategically.
Well, Navid, we really, really appreciate your analysis and your breakdown. Tehran-based journalist, looking forward to talking to you as soon as this continues, unfortunately, to develop, hopefully in a more positive direction soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.